Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm Michael Villa. I'm the Executive Director of smartEn, and I thank you for participating at our webinar to present our smartEn map on resource adequacy mechanisms. This is the first webinar that we are going to organize this year, and actually we're supposed to present the smartEn map in Amsterdam at FlexCon, at our biennial events that we are organizing with our partner FAN. But because of COVID, because of obvious reasons, we are forced to indeed transform that into a webinar. And this is the first of a series of webinars leading to FlexCon, which has been postponed to June, still in Amsterdam. Thanks a lot for the more than 200 registrations that we received for 2 days webinar, and we are really happy for this good outreach. What is the objective of today's webinar? Well, as I said, we are going to present our new smartEn map. smartEn maps are regular annual publications on different topics related to the role that demand-side sectors participates in the energy systems. And the topics are decided every year by smartEn members. We had publication on prosumers, on network tariffs and charges, on balancing markets, always looking at how demand-side resources participate in the clean energy systems. So in the 2021 map on resource adequacy mechanisms, we didn't look at capacity mechanisms, strategy research, or interoperability schemes in broadly. But indeed, we looked at the condition really to see if and how these schemes are open to decentralized energy resources. So we looked beyond the theoretical technology neutrality presentation of some of these resource adequacy mechanisms, and we looked specifically at the detail to see whether there were some barriers. And this is indeed the objective of this map. We look at 11 member states where indeed resource adequacy mechanisms of different type exist, and we also had 3 snapshots of 3 member states with capacity mechanisms or strategic reserves in evolutions or in creation of new ones. The countries that are not contemplated in this map which are instead covered in other maps simply are due to the fact that they exclusively rely on energy-only markets, and so indeed this is the reason of this scope of 11 plus 3 member states. So it's the result of a thorough analysis carried out throughout 2021, and we have interviewed more than 60 sources, including system operators, national authorities, and also our members. And indeed, in this present slide, I want to present you smartEn members. It's a broad membership of our European business organization of 70 companies, multinational, scale-up, startup, all offering solutions to enable all end users to become really active participants in the clean energy transition and support a more reliable and efficient energy systems. In the next slide, I would like to indeed to provide an overview of today's webinar. We have 80 minutes, and we have different interesting speakers. The first will be Annegret Groebel, the president of CEEAG, which also signed the foreword of our publication, and indeed she will open formally the webinar. Then we are going to have the presentation of the map by the lead author, our head of research and projects, Andrés Pinto-Bello. And then we are going to have a presentation, a specific spotlight to some national cases. And so we have Troughton from EnelX and Alicia Carrasco from Entra, which are going to dive into these cases. And then we have a conversation with Matt Wieckowski from the European Commission, DG Competition, which replaced Anna Colucci, which was originally in the agenda for today's, but because of some urgent meetings within the Commission cannot make it today. So we are very happy to have anyway Matt Wieckowski with us. We are going to have then conclude with a question and answer sections with the speakers. So please don't hesitate to submit your questions that we will ask to the speakers in this specific part of today's webinar. So I don't want to take further time, and I'm happy to hand over to Annegret Groebel, President of the Council of European Energy Regulators, for the opening keynote speech. Annegret, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you for inviting me to open the interesting seminar series that you just announced. I think this is a very timely planning, so to speak, and also I thank you for inviting me to contribute to the forward to your publication here on the smartEn map on resource adequacy mechanisms. I think this indeed is something that affects directly the work of the regulators as we have it today in the greater context of the energy transition. And as you know, CEER has a new strategy, empowering the consumer for the energy transition. And here we are placing the consumer in the center, and this relates to one of the elements that you mentioned, the demand side flexibility. And based on well-functioning markets, and I think here we need to mention the capacity mechanisms, resource adequacy assessments, and I'll come back to this in a minute. And of course, in order to make the whole energy system more flexible and in particular reach an integrated energy system which provides through the synergies more benefits for all users of the grid and for also, of course, providers, producers and operators. So I think this is a big challenge that we have for the energy transition, for moving overall to climate neutrality or net zero, as it is also sometimes called, to make the energy system more integrated. And that means integration of renewables into the grid as well as into the market, and ensuring that the system gets more flexible, because without an increased flexibility of the whole system, this integration of renewables, which is key to reach the energy transition targets, will not work out. And at the center of all this, we should place the consumer, because we should not forget that all these activities should bring benefits for the consumers. And while it is often said that consumers, let's say, do not profit or are not considered as an active part of the energy transition, we propose, in fact, the opposite, so that we say the consumer should contribute and can contribute through demand side flexibility, and of course also with distributed energy resources, and in that sense then to the energy transition, and in that sense then also benefit directly from the energy transition, so that we have a win-win situation. We think that this is key. And for this, we think that the energy system and the energy regulation needs to be based on well-functioning markets, where we define the role of all players in the way that the targets can be reached, and that there are enough incentives for all players to become more flexible and in that sense to contribute then to the to a flexible energy system and an integrated energy system. And in particular for the element of flexibility, we also have foreseen the several working steps and also for the decentralized and local energy, where we see a need that we can enable consumers to make use of the new possibilities in terms of flexibility, of demand side flexibility, which requires several, we think, several adjustments. And of course, also updates of, for example, tariff structures, of also new flexibility products. And in that sense, potentially also local markets, not necessarily separate flexibility markets, but a focus that we can directly let the consumers directly participate in this. And of course, this cannot be decoupled from wholesale markets or from mechanisms like capacity mechanisms, or as you call it, resource adequacy mechanisms, that, let's say, complement the market in case of a need due to resource adequacy resources. So this needs to be seen together as a whole, in a holistic perspective. And in all these cases, it is important that these is the rights and obligations in these new relationships and in these new market functioning, that the market is well functioning and that we give incentives to behave in a rational way, and that the price signals are not distorted, but that we get an efficient market outcome where the value to the system is priced in a way that the contribution is adequate to the benefits. And this needs to be fine-tuned. I think we have the instruments from the clean energy package on the electricity side, and of course all this has always been discussed preferably with a view to electricity renewables, or renewables on the electricity side, more on the electricity side. Now we also have the proposals for the gas side and the decarbonization of gas, so green gases, to name it, to refer to it. And here again, we need to see that this fits in the general well-functioning markets and allow consumers to participate actively and let's say have in that sense a dynamic approach, so that they can react to the differences in the need for flexibility, and in that sense then contribute to providing these flexibility to grid operators where needed. Without, of course, however, being deprived of certain consumer rights. Yeah, here the clear idea is that this does not deprive consumers from adequate protection, but rather empower them, enable them to make use of these options. And for these, of course, the products and the type of contracts with which they can enter into those relationships, into those market interactions, need to be well designed, so that the risk of failure is not unilaterally assigned to one side or the other. I think we are currently going through a period of very high price volatility, where some of the risks have become apparent. And we are all thinking currently on what to do to improve the situation without losing out of sight the long-term goal of energy transition. So we should not fall into the trap that due to the energy price volatility and the increase in energy prices that we see, that we, let's say, compromise on the long-term benefits of moving moving in the right direction of the energy transition. This should not be blocked or deviated from this path, but rather the opposite, because I think in the long run, we all will benefit from using more renewables, from making the system flexible, and from integrating properly the renewables, an increasing share of renewables in the markets as well as in the grid. And that, I think, is the new integrated energy system in the sense that I described it, and is in a more flexible system where the consumer is at the center and can contribute and benefit at the same time from being part of the system, being a more active part of this dynamic system, moving towards the energy transition targets. I hope I was in time. I thank you all for the attention, and I'm happy to react. And I'm also very keen on now listening to the concrete examples that we are going to hear now and presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annegret, for presenting your view. And this is definitely a view where I see a lot of coherence between the CEER and the smartEn view of a consumer-centric approach and consumer-centric market design. However, as indeed Andrés will explain us soon in a few minutes, you will see that several of the barriers for demand side, so consumers of all types to participate in resource adequacy mechanisms are regulatory barriers. Do you think that the Fit for 55 package, including the new state aid guidelines, in particular the aid for security supplies, can help to add an additional enabling framework for this participation of demand-side resources to, specifically in this case, a resource adequacy mechanism, but also other schemes? You stress in particular the complementarity of the different markets. Mm-hmm. So what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily agree to that the obstacles are mainly regulatory. I think now we have the instruments, and what we need to do is design some of the products. That, of course, is something that needs to be done jointly with, in particular, the distribution system operators and consumers on the other side to match the needs and the possibilities on both sides to enable this. And as I said, the adequacy mechanism is, or the assessment and then using capacity mechanisms is in the clean energy package designed in such a way that it is a second best and that it should function as much as possible in a market-based approach, including, and here this is what I call complementarity, including the possibility of, for example, consumers and DER to participate in the wholesale markets, and I think that is the key that we need to to enable. But I don't see that there is, let's say, a barrier which cannot be overcome. But rather, we just need to enable it now, yeah. So or activate, let's say, activate the instruments that we have now with the clean energy package, and will have with the new proposals in the Fit for 55, but also in the of course in the new gas and package. And I think also there are already some elements where we see like the communities, the energy communities, and renewable energy communities, where we see a start in some of the member states already. But I think that is also something that is kind of now needs to fit into the system that was based on a different type of network and energy system design. But I think there is a transition. Yeah, that's not only the whole system is, but the concrete steps of transitioning, of inserting these type of new possibilities of flexibility needs to be activated now. Together with consumers and producers and regulatory oversight to ensure that there is a fair transition for all and no one is left behind, and taking into account that also consumers have different degrees of, let's say, risk averseness. So we should force no one, but we should allow those that want to have to participate in these to move on, if you like. Yeah, with all the conditions that enable a fair market outcome.
Very good, very good. Thanks a lot, Annegret, for your opening speech, for signing the foreword of our publication. And then talking about our publication, I give the floor to the lead author of this publication, Andrés Pinto-Bello, our head of research and projects at smartEn, for the presentation of the main outcomes of this map. Andrés, you have the floor.
Hello, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Annegret, for this introduction that I will hopefully reflect on also in the upcoming slides. And without further ado, I think we can just start and move on to the first slide and the first map already. So we have seen already before there are a lot of monitoring reports that analyze the different resource adequacy mechanisms across Europe. In particular, CEER and ACER, they do an excellent job in this monitoring. But there is not a strong focus, and this is what we wanted to achieve, on how distributed energy resources, and in particular demand-side flexibility, can participate into those mechanisms, as Michael was mentioning in the introduction. And the reason why many of these reports might not have this focus is apparent in this first map, I would say, and it is because there's very limited participation from distributed energy resources today in these mechanisms across Europe, and in particular, almost none or very limited presence of demand response and demand-side flexibility. There are two main reasons that we have seen for this. And going back to what Annegret was saying, indeed, regulation already allows many options or opens up the floor to interesting product designs. However, what we have seen is that the products that exist are designed with traditional resources in mind, and for a very good reason, because, I mean, resource adequacy is risk averse in general. We don't want lights to go off, of course. So it is reasonable that until now, the technologies that have been used are the ones already available. They are the ones tried and tested for many years. However, this is very limiting in the scope of what can be achieved with the new technologies that are available. And the second reason for this underdeveloped participation of flexibility is maybe the limited market-based approach that we see. And in markets, it is where demand-side flexibility can thrive more due to the nature, the distributed nature of smaller assets, but also the different cost structures that they have. And maybe two highlights from this overview is, the first one is maybe the France. the special dedicated product for demand response that they have. It has its own flaws. It's not perfect, but it already recognizes the important role that this technology can play in securing system resiliency. And the second, and maybe more important, because it can serve as a blueprint for the future, is the newly designed capacity mechanism in Belgium. It's a truly inclusive product, technology inclusive product. It has 2 timeframes, 4 and 1 year, where different technologies can stand out depending on this time frame. It has stronger decarbonization targets than the electricity regulation requires. And from what our interviews with market participants told us, they have a quite fair pre-qualification process. So this is a really a product that could be seen as a blueprint for future capacity products across Europe. Now, if we move on to the next slide, what we analyzed in our map, just as an overview, what you can find is the different types of resource adequacy mechanisms. They can be sorted into 3 main categories: capacity mechanisms or capacity markets, strategic reserves, and interruptible loads. And it is a bit difficult to compare these different mechanisms, in particular in different countries, because every country has different needs and available technologies. And based on that, they choose the mechanism that is better suited to their system needs. So don't take this comparison as an absolute comparison between which country does best, but rather in each country, what are the possibilities for demand-side flexibility? And that is what we're actually grading. And beyond France and Belgium, the countries that allow for more demand response participation right now are the ones that have interruptibility schemes in place that engage industrial consumers. So this is mostly very large energy consumers, and it leaves out a very significant segment of the demand side, really. So beyond that, most products are really generation heavy and designed in a way that really fits the available resources for the reasons that I mentioned before, because they've been really tried and tested, and system operators feel comfortable with them, with good reason, of course. Now, if we move to the next slide, the participating assets, I already mentioned a few of them. It's mostly traditional generation. They take up to 3/4 of are provided by nuclear, coal, and gas-fired plants. Demand response and battery storage amount to very small percentages, and only in some select countries, for example, in France and Great Britain, they have maybe the largest presence of storage, and it still only amounts to 3% of the total capacity being contracted. So the reason why this happens is not because regulation doesn't allow it, but it's really that the design system, the product design is, or the technology requirements are really limiting the presence of demand response or distributed energy resources at large. And that we can see in the next slide, where we have a full section dedicated to technology requirements. This is maybe the largest issue for participation of demand-side flexibility. And there is this concept, and yes, all mechanisms, or mostly all mechanisms that we have analyzed, are technology neutral on paper. And by technology neutral, what is considered is that they don't explicitly exclude some kind of technology. However, this is not sufficient, and that's why we talk about the technology inclusivity as a concept. So rather than just not excluding explicitly a technology, making sure that everybody can actually participate that is well suited to the system needs. And how do we see these limitations? There can be, they're mostly in the pre-qualification process. There can be significant barriers there. There's limitations for aggregation of different resources, so demand and generation, minimum bit sizes that are way too large for aggregated demand resources, or activation times that are too long, and tests that are either too taxing for the providers or too frequent. And the reasons of these pre-qualification requirements are not always justifiable by or that's what we've gathered. They're not always justifiable by the actual system needs or what the product should accomplish. So we want both these technology requirements and the requirements by the system to go hand in hand and really reflect the needs of the system. And here again, I mentioned maybe the Belgian case stands out for the reasons earlier mentioned. It sets a good blueprint with reasonable requisites that are linked to the needs of the system operator. Now, of course, all these are the three main sections that we have in our smart map, and then we look into the 11 countries into a bit more detail and on how they perform in each of these three sections. This is a very high-level summary that I'm more than happy to answer any questions on it. And of course, you can check out the full report. But then, just as a final slide, how can we actually foster and further develop European resource adequacy mechanisms? So the revision of the state aid guidelines has already set some excellent blueprint for that. It allows, it really allows the development, as Annegret was mentioning before, and implementing these new innovative product designs. So mostly, the main reasons where we can move forward is really move towards this technology inclusivity term rather than technology neutrality, because even if a technology is not explicitly excluded, it can still be done so through the product design. We should also in that line, product requirements should be linked to the actual system needs. Like I said, for example, in the Belgian case, rather than being designed around the technologies that we already have used. So it is very easy to not exclude, but again, we should move product design further into what current technologies can provide. And then to increase also participation, first, of course, the market-based approach should be at the forefront, but also we need to be able to give investment security to developers. So to have lasting financial incentives to go into these investments, so long-term contracts, for example. And finally, on the procurement side, processes and the red tape should be simplified, open to all aggregators like independent, open to all actors, including all independent aggregators, and really follow this market-based approach. And with that, I will pass it again to Michael. But of course, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out or leave them in the chat. You can, from this morning already, download the full report from our website, and I hope it's an interesting read and it stirs up some interesting ideas. Thank you.
Very good. Thanks a lot, Andres, for this overview. And indeed, go on our website, download the publication. Andres indeed presenting the overview of our analysis, but you will have indeed insights for all member states that are touched by our analysis. So indeed, you can have more information by reading the publication, but also now we are going to have some snapshots discussions and overviews by two speakers that are giving a specific overview on the Spanish, on the UK, on the Great Britain and the Irish case. And I would start with Alicia Carrasco, the Executive Director of Entra, to help us go through what's happening in Spain. Alicia.
Hi, Michael. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. Thanks to Andrés for the excellent report that you all coordinated together. So it's a pleasure for me to be here with the rest of the speakers, the previous and the coming months. So in Entra is Nale, if we go to the next slide, is the association that is looking to promote demand response participation in all the markets in Spain, and to promote that this participation is not discriminatory. So the coalition and the association Entra was founded in 2018, and we managed to get some of the requirements to participate in the balancing services a bit lower than they were initially requested. But even though this is a long way to push in all the moments to influence the regulations, if we can go to, and so far we are different types of members, from utilities, retailers, distribution companies, solution providers, aggregator, and so on. So what we want to show is that we are a very well mix of companies that are part of the association. So what we want to do and what we focus is on unblocking the value of demand-side flexibility in the market. And we want to support that the European Union regulations and the framework that is somehow being worked at the European level, and with the electricity directive and the electricity regulation, they are implemented in Spain as more with competition and in a non-discriminatory way. So with that, we want to promote the creation of local flexibility market applying the Article 32. We want to promote that the Article 13 and 37 of the directive are implemented, and not only the retailer can participate in the resources of flexibility to the market, but also the independent aggregator. This is on track of the regulations that are happening, are to be changed in this coming few months here in Spain. And we want to have a capacity market. We have asked for a capacity market, and we have replied to the consultation that was released last year in April, and that was followed up by a report of the regulator, CNC, which was already much more open to non-discriminatory measures and requirements and to more competition, that it was the initial competition. So this is in a nutshell what we ask on behalf of Entra and our members. So if we can move to the next slide. So if we see what is happening today in Spain, so we have some balancing services and ancillary services that are opened, but not yet to independent aggregator, only to the retailer, providing the flexibility of demand in the balancing services that are open to participation. We have to say that all the markets, all the balancing services that are being reviewed, they all start talking and start allowing market participation on demand response. And the independent aggregator will participate when the regulator and the Minister of Energy work on during this month, by May this year, on the definition of the responsibilities and the role of the independent aggregator in Spain. The situation why independent aggregators are not yet participating in the balancing services, and yes, the retailer, is because in Spain the implementation of the network code, the balancing network code, took a time that was a bit earlier than the implementation of the electricity directive, and that's why the markets, the balancing services, are open to demand response, but to the independent aggregators will be now this year, when they execute what is say in the climate energy transition and climate law of the Spanish Minister of Energy. So this is when we know by sure, by May this year, this definition of what are the responsibility of the independent aggregator will have finally defined. Afterwards, Red Eléctrica have to include this in the operational procedure, but this is the right procedure to follow. The capacity mechanism has been, as we say, open to consultation, proposed by the Minister of Energy and, in fact, by the Secretary of State, and it was reviewed by the CNC. there were a few limiting requirements that we can explain in the coming slide. But the good news are that the report from the regulators is much more open to non-discriminatory measures than the initial report. Then the electricity markets, as we know, are not yet open to demand response, but they're planning to be open this year. The interoperable lot that was open in Spain for technical reasons closed already. And what we are starting to see are pilots for demand side, for local flexibility market or the DSO constraint management. There are several pilots that are running in Spain. One is a national pilot run by OMIE that is still on the pilot proposal stage, but it's called CEER. And the idea is to promote and to define how the products that will participate in local flexibility markets in the future. So this is the starting point. And the good thing is like still on pilots, but this is happening. And then if we go to the next slide, just to say this is the roadmap of capacity market in Spain. So in summer 2020, there was already a proposal, a consultation to have a strategic reserve in Spain, but this stayed there. It didn't go forward. But then this year, in April in 2021, we did have, last year in April 2021, we did have a consultation coming from the Secretary of State that they proposed to have a capacity market. We from Entra did react to the consultation because despite we do ask for a capacity market, we do see that the proposal was all but open to competition, and there were a lot of discriminatory proposals that we did show in our response to the consultation, and that most of them were taken by the report of the CNC, which is already one step forward. So one of the things we saw on the initial consultation is that only installations of demand storage of generation could participate in the capacity market. Only those installations that are larger than 1 megawatt. But it didn't recognize the aggregation of any kind of asset, either demand, either generation, or either storage. So this is going against the Article 17 of the Electricity Directive that is asking for member states to permit and promote the use of aggregation of demand response in all markets. So the fact that aggregation wasn't allowed, this was already non-discriminatory. So this is one of the things that was a no-go. So it didn't allow the aggregation. Another thing that for us was a no-go is that it did ask that the consumers that were to participate in the capacity market needed to have 51% of the consumption during the hours of what we call tariff 6. And these are the hours that go from midnight to 8 in the morning. That means most of the industrial consumers do consume at a moment, but not the domestic consumers. We also think that this is going against the proposal behind a capacity mechanism. A capacity mechanism try to secure that there is security of supply when it's needed. So we do believe that if a security of supply might be called some elements or sites to provide security of supply, maybe it's not happening in the night, but most likely it will happen during the day. The fact that they only allow installations and not no aggregation of installation, either demand generation of storage, this somehow put a limit on how you can participate there. And the more people and sites and aggregated loads participate in the capacity market, the more resources will be, therefore more capacity to secure security on supply, and also it will be a lower cost for consumers, which also we are looking for this. And the final thing is I want to put on the table that there is, if we look at the ENSOE modeling for resource adequacy that was open to consultation last year at the very end, there was a situation, there was some numbers that say that in Spain by 2025, there could be, if we close combined cycle and if we close some gas generation unit, there might be a need of 718 megawatts of demand response. So today, in those markets and space services that are open to demand response without ancillary services, only 1 megawatt of demand response is participating. And it took them almost between 9 months and a year to certify this unit. So if we want to have this amount by 2025, we need to open all markets, and we need to open also the requirements to participate in the market and to ease it and facilitate that demand response can participate in all markets. So this is, if we go to the next slide, this is what I wanted to talk through you today about what's the situation in Spain and what is the capacity market. And if you need more information, you can contact smartEn, or this is here my email. So thank you very much, Michael, and I'm looking forward for the questions.
Thanks a lot, Alicia. There are already some questions in the chat. We can indeed reply directly through the chat, but now I would like to give the floor to Paul Troughton from EnelX to help us go through in another case. Paul.
Thank you, Michael. So I've been asked to talk about the UK and Ireland, but because I'm going to be quite negative about those, first of all, I'd just like to make one thing clear. I think capacity markets are a good thing in general, and they're a good thing for demand-side flexibility. And the reason for this is quite clear. You know, there's a wide range of different types of flexibility you can get out of customer loads. It's a huge spectrum, but there's a lot of it that shares these characteristics, that you can get it to be available for quite low costs, and it will be very reliable, so long as you can be sure that you're not going to use it very frequently. And that's a very good fit for a capacity market. So that's what a capacity market really does for participating customers, is it allows that kind of load to participate. There are others, but that's a really useful one for solving these problems. The other thing a capacity market does is it pays customers to be available. And there's some nice studies showing that really simplifies the decision-making for customers. It fits very well with what motivates a customer to participate. So that's good too. But also just empirically, if you look around the world at power systems that have a decent amount of demand-side flexibility, they're the ones which have capacity markets. Now, if you look at what a capacity market is for, then it becomes clear why this is. This is showing a residual load duration curve for Ireland in 2017. So by residual load, I mean this is showing the total demand on the system minus the generation that comes from variable renewables. So this is the problem that has to be solved by all the dispatchable resources on the system, which is what capacity markets have always been for. But as you've added more renewables, the demands have become more pronounced. In particular, if you look at the top here, there's this big spike where on this 6 gigawatt system, there's a gigawatt which is only needed for a few hours in the year. So the job of the capacity market is to make it worthwhile to build the resources that, even though they'll only be needed for a few hours in the year. If you relied on just energy market revenues, no one would look at this and say that's a viable business case, I'll build my resource. But if you do this just from the supply side, what that means is you're saying we need to pay people enough for them to decide to build several extra power stations that will hardly be used. It works, that's what capacity markets have always done, but it's not going to be a cheap thing to do. Whereas, as we just said, there's an awful lot of demand-side flexibility which can be had for low cost that will meet this need very well. So what I conclude from this is that if you have a capacity market that doesn't make good use of those demand-side resources, it will be needlessly expensive. Okay, let's talk about GB. I'm saying here that it was designed for gas-fired generators. I think that's self-evident, even if it's notionally technology neutral. There are many things that are wrong with the capacity market design in Great Britain. And some of them are mentioned in the report. Some of them have been debated hugely over the years. I'm happy to talk about them in the Q&A. But I'd like to focus on this last one, the lack of a dispatch mechanism, because it may seem incredible, but this is actually true. When you take on a capacity obligation in an auction to deliver 1 megawatt in this market, your obligation is to deliver that megawatt whenever there is a system stress event. But you don't get told about a system stress event until after it has happened. after it's finished, in fact. Now, that seems totally bizarre, but it's true. What you do get ahead of time is a capacity market notice. Now, as it happens, there was one yesterday, but the one I have here is the first one that happened after market launch. It was issued just after midday, and it has a start time here saying 4:30, but it has no end time. So what this notice actually says is sometime between 4:30 this afternoon and the end of the universe, there will be a system stress event. And you have no more official word until this notice is cancelled, which it was that evening. So between those times, your job as a capacity provider is to use your skill and judgment to guess whether there's really going to be a system stress event, and if so, when, and then make sure you're delivering during that time. Now, that sounds mad, but the reason this kind of made sense, possibly to the designers, was that if you're a gas-fired generator, which was all they were thinking about, then it's easy, because the circumstances in which these kind of notices will come out, the energy prices will tend to be high, so gas-fired generators will want to be running all afternoon, all evening at a profit. But from the demand side, it looks very different. For a start, you don't get any energy market revenue. So whenever you dispatch your resources, it costs you money and you earn nothing. But also, as we said before, there are many, many customers for whom the cost of a dispatch, the opportunity costs they incur, are very high. So you absolutely have to minimize the number and duration of dispatches. So you're left having to do this guesswork. And that cannot be a sensible design. It just puts a huge amount of risk onto this class of resources for no reason. So Ireland, I wouldn't say their market was designed for a particular technology, but it wasn't properly thought through. It looked fine, and in fact, very good when it was first proposed. It uses reliability options, which I believe are the Commission's favored type of capacity market, which are very clever and elegant, in that, rather than having some physical obligations, but instead the obligation you take on when you take on a megawatt in an auction is actually a financial derivative. So what you're required to do is, whenever the energy price goes above the strike price, which happens to be about 500 odd euros in Ireland, you are obliged to pay out the difference between the energy price and the strike price. And the idea is that you offer your resource into the market so that it will be dispatched when the prices go high. You earn your energy market revenues and you pay out the difference from those. All very neat. If you don't manage to deliver energy during those times, then you still have to pay out, but you don't have the revenues. So that forms a penalty, and the penalty is based on market prices rather than an administrative mechanism. So that's what makes it quite elegant. But there's some underlying assumptions there. First of all, that you'll earn the market price when you're dispatched. That actually wasn't the case for demand-side resources when the market launched, because they hadn't got energy market participation working. So they had a temporary workaround that was allowed under the state aid approval. Actually, they still haven't got proper energy market participation for demand-side resources. So we now have an interim state aid compliance mechanism, which is another temporary workaround. Hopefully, we'll get there eventually. But the other assumption is that, if you offer your resources into the market and the prices go really, really high, then you'll be dispatched so that you can earn the revenues. And it turns out that's not true either. A lot of participants and the regulators and the market operator discovered this rather painfully last September, where there was a week of very high prices. And many participants, generators and demand side alike, had their resources offered into the market, but the system operator didn't choose to dispatch them. They didn't think they would help solve the problem at that particular time. But the consequence of that for those participants was they had to make these payouts without having any revenue. So they're effectively being very harshly penalized for failing to deliver, even though they were doing nothing wrong. They were desperate to deliver, but they weren't being allowed to by the system operator. So, that was a disaster. It's been fixed by a retrospective rule change that lowered the prices during that week. Not an elegant way out. And now then needs to be a debate on how do we actually make this market design work properly. So I've said bad things about GB and Ireland, but just to be clear, both of these systems are better off and have a higher level of demand-side participation than they would have without these capacity markets, imperfect though they are. But surely we can do better market designs. It sounds like the Belgian one's good. What I would say I've learned from these is that you need to be technology inclusive, to use the phrase Andrés used. So rather than just fixating on, this is the thing that I'm hoping someone will build, I'll make sure the market works for that. You need to think through every kind of market and get every kind of technology that could plausibly contribute to resource adequacy and get the details right to accommodate them. And for the demand side, that means the proposition to customers has to be something that makes sense. You can say, we'll pay you to be available and we'll heavily penalize you if you turn out not to be reliable. That's fine. But if you also say, and we might just bankrupt you for no fault of your own, that's not a sellable proposition. The Clean Energy Package recognizes the importance of independent aggregators, but in practice, many capacity markets don't really accommodate aggregation, and that needs to be fixed. If you're looking to aggregate together lots of small resources to make large, reliable ones, then the per site costs matter. And it's very easy to have, sort of telemetry requirements or even just paperwork, which, adds a cost per site such that it's not worth having small sites participating. So you need to avoid that barrier. And as we discussed earlier, there's a lot of resources that are a very good fit for the actual problem the capacity market is trying to solve, but don't want to be dispatched frequently. So you need to make sure there aren't other features of your capacity market design, the testing regime and so on, which cause them to incur such huge costs that they won't want to participate. But if you get all those things right, there's a big win to be had. There's the market will find the most cost-effective technologies, will go through the energy transition at much lower cost than we otherwise would. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Paul. Really clear presentation. And as you said, details matter. This is really an important message. And because of these details, I would like to then give the floor to Matt from the European Commission, Matt Wieckowski, case handler at the DG Competition of the European Commission, to present how the new state aid guidelines can help solve these details that matter so much to allow demand-side resources to participate in a technology inclusive way in all resource adequacy mechanisms. Matt, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to be here, and thank you for the very interesting work on the map and the other presentations. So yeah, I'm going to talk to you. Well, my name is Matt Wieckowski. I work in a team in DG Competition looking at state aid in the energy sector. So what I'll do today is briefly describe what these CEEAG are. Very briefly, as I suppose most people are somewhat familiar. And then I'll talk in a bit more detail about what the rules are for capacity mechanisms or resource adequacy measures and how they differ from the previous rules. So on the next slide, please. Thanks. So yeah, so state aid is any benefit transferred by the state to undertakings that compete in the internal market. And in general, that's prohibited under the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, but it can be authorized if it's notified to DG Competition before it's granted and approved under certain rules. And the state aid guidelines that we produce are the rule book that we use to assess aid that member states wish to grant and see if it can be found compatible with the treaty. So between 2014 and 2021, the rulebook for the energy and environment sector was called the EEAG. That stood for the Guidelines on State Aid for Environmental Protection and Energy. And then following a multi-year review process over the last few years, the new CEEAG came into force on the 1st of January this year. And the new C in the acronym stands for climate. So the title is now the Guidelines on State Aid for Climate, Environmental Protection and Energy. And the idea, the kind of overarching idea with these new guidelines, the CEEAG, is to facilitate state aid measures that support the achievement of the updated climate targets, so the 2030 and 2050 targets, to make aid much more difficult for fossil fuels that are generally incompatible with that target, and by that we mostly mean all the fossil fuels other than natural gas, and then for natural gas to set new conditions for projects involving gas. So much more of an overt environmental focus this time. There are also some significant changes then in these new, aside from this kind of more environmental approach, there are significant changes compared to the 2014 guidelines. And they include, for example, a move away from what was generally a kind of technology by technology approach in the 2014 rulebook to an approach that's based more on, that includes an overarching big chapter on decarbonisation measures. And that includes common rules now for all sorts of different approaches to decarbonisation. So support for renewable electricity, gas and heat, as well as potentially low carbon hydrogen production, other forms of electrification, and the kind of greening of industrial processes. All these things that can deliver decarbonisation can then potentially be assessed under these same rules. And the idea of that is to support the development of more open and competitive measures where member states wish to use them, and also hopefully to make these guidelines a bit more future-proof, since there are definitely advantages to having a chapter per technology. It's kind of simpler because you just, when you want to do something, you go to that part, although it's more complicated if you want to do an open and inclusive measure. But also this should make it more future-proof because it means that we don't have to define exactly what aid can be used for, and if interesting new technologies are developed or new approaches arise, those can more easily be accommodated under these broader rules. We also, in general, in the rules, increased the flexibility for using different types of aid contracts, and because we gave quite a lot more flexibility in that regard, we've added some additional safeguards. And one of those is a new requirement for public consultation of large budget state aid measures. Okay, so my next slide, please. Here, talking a bit more about security of electricity supply in particular, and these resource adequacy measures. So here, overall, the message I'd say is that the rules have not changed dramatically since 2014. And this slide provides a summary. So first, I mean, in between the 2014 state aid guidelines and these new 2022 CEEAG guidelines, we also had the 2019 electricity regulation, and that introduced important rules for security of supply. And so one of the things that we're doing is aligning with those. I mean, they were already reasonably well aligned with the 2014 rules. But part of that is that we need to clarify the scope here. So the rules in the electricity regulation apply specifically to capacity mechanisms, which is a defined term in the regulation. But sometimes we see state aid measures that don't meet that definition in the regulation of a capacity mechanism, but must still be assessed by us, given they involve state aid. And so one of the things we've done is clarified, I mean, this is clarifying what was already happening and kind of legally had to happen anyway, but we're clarifying here a bit more explicitly that the CEAG apply to measures that are for security of electricity supply and involve state aid, but do not qualify as capacity mechanisms. And that could include, for example, measures for dealing with grid congestion and resulting regional security of supply issues, or measures that are aimed at delivering flexibility but don't meet the definition of a capacity mechanism. Second box on the slide is just to point out that the core rules from 2014 haven't changed. So the need for these measures needs to be justified. That might be on the basis of an adequacy assessment, and that will be the case for capacity mechanisms. It could also be the case that it should also be based on a reliability standard, which is like a kind of cost-benefit analysis where you set a target for justifying the amount of security of supply you're aiming to achieve with a measure. But that could also be a kind of some similar type of cost-benefit analysis for measures that don't qualify as capacity mechanisms. Other requirements that we keep are the requirement generally for measures to be open to competing technologies that can deliver the objective, and the general requirement that there's a competitive process to select between those eligible technologies. The third section here is where we have changed the rules somewhat to provide more flexibility for member states to use their security of supply measures to also support or deliver environmental objectives. And so this could be, for example, by setting eligibility rules that exclude more polluting beneficiaries or providing better terms to greener beneficiaries. And then following the general approach across the new guidelines that aims to close the door to possible subsidies for coal or similarly polluting fossil fuels, we also explain that the emissions threshold from the electricity regulation would also apply to measures that don't qualify as capacity mechanisms under the regulation. And that's to phase out support for fossil fuels. Fourth, there is a new requirement that will start in July 2023 for member states to have a public consultation when they have large budget security of supply measures. And there's also a new requirement for the costs of security of supply measures to be borne by the consumers that benefit from the measure. The idea being to try and help incentivize further demand response. And finally, I just put a note on this slide to point out that while this is a summary of the rules on resource adequacy, and it's the most likely rules for any capacity mechanism to be assessed under, there are a few different places in the guidelines. They cover a lot of different things, and there are a few different places where storage and demand response might also be supported. So for example, measures for decarbonisation could put into competition storage and demand response as well as other types of decarbonisation measure in the sector. Measures for building energy performance might include storage and demand response, and also measures for infrastructure, including electric vehicle charging. So I hope that provides a useful summary of the new rules, and I'm very happy to join the discussion and take any questions.
Thanks a lot, Matt, for this overview of the new state aid guidelines. And now I would indeed like to invite the other speakers to join in a Q&A session. We are already receiving many questions in the box chat, and this is really a background team effort to reply as much as possible to the questions that you are submitting. So thanks a lot for being so active and interested in this webinar. But I will start first with a question to the speakers, to all speakers. And really, I would like to reflect on the fact that we have already several regulations already in place. The 2019 electricity regulation, part of the electricity market design. The ENSO already defined their first European resource adequacy assessment, which set the framework under which eventually resource adequacy mechanisms could be established. And now we have also the new state aid guidelines. Do you think that they are enough to change the status quo and ensure indeed a technology inclusive approach, or the details that matters that Paul was mentioning are still needs to be solved somehow differently, and the principles set at European level are too much high level, and so we need to look at more on some details. What's your opinion?
If I can go first, I will say we have to fight the details. I have worked many years focused on the European Union regulations and guidance. I'm working through Entra a lot in the member states in Spain. So you have to really focus on the details, because each country, each member state have to combine the situation, what it's possible to be done under the framework that is set up by the European Union. So sometimes the details do matter a lot. Most of the time they do matter a lot. I say before, there is just one unit of demand response that have been certified to participate in the ancillary services in Spain, and this was done by the regulatory team of Endesa. So if you are an independent aggregator and you need 9 months to certify 1 megawatt, this is a lot. So you need to ease and facilitate that all the details are made easier for the technology providers. And I agree with Paul, they should be defined to all kind of technology that can provide the service, and not just looking at one kind of technology. And then when you have to change the requirements, you need to see that they've been defined for this kind of specific technology. So the detail matters a lot.
Very good. And so I think that the ball then is in the hands of the Commission, because member states can shape whatever mechanisms they want, but then it's the Commission that's really needed to check and ensure that the principle of equal treatment, which is clearly stated in the new state aid guideline, is respected. So my question is to Paul: how will the Commission ensure that there is no technology bias and technology inclusive principles reflected, in the product designs?
It's a good question. I mean, I think the guidelines, the previous guidelines look pretty good. So it is just a question of more rigor. I can't spell out what a good process would look like from Matt's point of view. Presumably, broader consultation, actually listen to people from the different technologies, active engagement. It's very easy, and we saw this with Ireland and GB and others, to lay out a plausible story of how the market will work. It needs to be looked at more skeptically and from the point of view of all the different technologies to figure out where the flaws might be.
So Matt, what's your plan?
Well, I think so. One of the things we've introduced is precisely a public consultation requirement, recognizing that this is extremely complicated. I mean, I've been involved in this area for a while. I've had discussions with your members, lots of people who are experts in this area, and it's not as though it's easy to spot the flaws in the rule book at the beginning. I mean, the devil is absolutely in the detail. I mean, I completely agree with that, and that's the same for market design as well as state aid measure design. But so the first thing we've done is to say that we want to see a public consultation, and especially we're interested in the views of the kind of niche technologies or approaches that might be excluded if we're not careful when we're looking at these measures. So there's one step we've taken. I mean, I think that I am very interested in this discussion about technology inclusivity. I mean, I think it's difficult, I think, to define exactly what we're trying to do here, because I don't think it's always the case. I mean, I do. So to start, let me say first, I think I see the benefits of this. I think it's clearly important to avoid designing markets or other measures solely based on what have been the historic technologies. That's obviously a mistake. It's clear that opening to new innovative technologies and approaches delivers not only much better value, but also better environmental outcomes. So, I mean, I think we're fully aligned there. But I do wonder if there might be a limit with the concept of this inclusivity, because it's not necessarily the case that everybody should have a slice, right? It doesn't just, there will be better and worse approaches. I mean, and the idea of a competitive mechanism is that it helps discover what those are, and it awards more of the rewards to the most cost-effective ways in which the objectives can be delivered. So yeah, I think that there's a kind of a limit there, and we might see, I think, and approve potentially measures that exclude more polluting providers, more expensive providers, or more unreliable providers, and that might be excluded up front, or it might be excluded through a competitive process that awards contracts and benefits to others. And then one more thing I wanted to say is, so I think it's really interesting we have a kind of balance between giving the best scrutiny we can to the rules, looking at the contributions from others, and trying to make the best job we can of making sure rules are suitably open, and where there are limitations or someone might lose out, that's justifiable based on an objective. But also leaving, and we need to use the state aid process responsibly to lock in certain rules to make sure that the rights of certain potential beneficiaries are protected. So it's very important what we write in the decisions, because that limits the flexibility for rules to be changed later. But the problem is because this area is really complicated, I think it's also important to leave some flexibility for learning by doing, and allowing member states. Member states aren't always trying to create bad outcomes. They want to, for good reasons, sometimes develop and change the rules and learn from experience. I think I think some of the issues Paul's presented, it's a very interesting presentation, but some of these issues with the Irish mechanism, especially, I think, were not spotted by anybody really at the time that we were taking a decision. And so the best outcome, there's kind of not a better job we could necessarily have done. The important thing is to make sure we have listened to anyone who had a point to raise, and then we lock in the important bits that need to be fixed, but also leave flexibility for Ireland to improve the rules over time.
Very good. So message really clear received. Consultation are the way to go, and definitely full agreement that technology inclusiveness should not be a principle, a standalone principle, but it should be combined with the cost effectiveness. And because indeed we needed to strive to achieve decarbonization in the most efficient way. And in Paul's presentation, it was clearly stressed this point of how demand-side resources can be the most cost-effective ones to participate in schemes, to then contribute to a more efficient system. Two last questions. First one to Paul. Paul, you have experience also in Italy, and in the capacity mechanism in Italy, there is no participation at all of demand response. Why?
Well, this is not one where there were subtle issues that were not obvious from the open design. I don't think it should ever have been approved. It doesn't tick any of the boxes for demand-side participation. It does not allow aggregation at all. It does not have anything like a comprehensible customer proposition. It essentially seems to have been designed that, we should get demand response into this new market, but we want to make it look as much as possible like a legacy interruptible program. And yeah, that's not a sensible approach. Now, I'm optimistic that there will be sensible engagement. Yeah, now that what was predicted has happened, that there's been zero participation, there's clearly something that needs to be fixed. And there are enough good role models around that you can say, well, what we have doesn't look like anything that works. What do we need to change to make it look like something that will work?
Exactly. The learning curve that Matt was mentioning, let's hope that is not too long. Alicia, going back to your presentation, one of the first slide was clearly presenting that there are still some barriers in the other existing market. So according to Entra's assessment, do you think that first we need to eliminate barriers in the other existing markets before then opening and setting up a capacity mechanism, which is actually the principle of appropriateness that the Commission is also including very clearly in their new state aid guidelines. And this is also a principle that is well defined in the electricity market design. So what's your assessment, Alicia?
So my assessment is very clear. We have to work both at the parallel. The capacity market will take up to 15 months to be designed, step forward, and get approval by the European Union. So I would say we have to work in both parallel.
Good.
Opening, lifting the barriers, current barriers, at the same time, working for a well-designed, not discriminatory capacity market scheme.
We have some troubles to hear you, but indeed, we can hear your reply somehow. Voila, we are reaching the end of our 80 minutes webinar. I thank a lot Andrés for presenting the map, and Matt, Paul, and Alicia for the insightful presentations and good discussion that we had. And also thanks also for replying to, in writing to the questions that we are receiving in the chat. Now, I would like to indeed conclude today's webinar by simply, because of a question of time, reminding you that you can download on our website the map, the smartEn map on Resource Adequacy Mechanism. You are also going to receive soon the link of the video recording of today's webinar. So indeed you can also have a look at the presentation and what was discussed during the day in another occasion. And then I would also invite you to participate to another webinar in the context of this Road to FlexCon, indeed a 2 days event that we're going to have in June. And the next webinar is going to be on energy communities, how they can support local system efficiency. And the webinar is going to be on the 15th of February, where we are going indeed to present another publication specifically on energy communities. And then the other reminder is for FlexCon, indeed, a 2 days event that we are going to organize in Amsterdam between the 27th and 28th of June, together with our partner fun. So do not hesitate to register for these insightful discussions, where we are going to have several parallel presentations of innovative business models to unleash the flexibility potential from all decentralized energy resources. So really, that's an opportunity to meet in person and exchange and really gather all together to talk about demand accessibility and the participation of all end users. More publications are also coming up from smartEn. First, a joint market monitor by smartEn and Delta E on really a market monitor for demand accessibility. We are going to announce that soon, but it's going to be published in the next weeks. And also, 22nd of March, the monitoring report of the implementation of the electricity market design, how member states are advancing on these major framework that can indeed eliminate the barriers, the regulatory barriers for the development of demand accessibility. So follow smartEn, keep engaging with us, and I would like to conclude by thanking all of you for your participation, and do not hesitate to get in touch with us to know more about smartEn and our activities. Thanks a lot, and have a nice day.